very much indeed, Distinguished Vice President. Excellencies, distinguished members of the Council, esteemed colleagues of civil society, once again thank you so very much for the thoughtful engagement with this oral update, at the expression of concerns and mutual understanding in that regard, and the opportunity to engage those. In your remarks variously, there were four major themes I think that stood out where you sought further remarks on behalf of the High Commissioner. Accountability, the situation of migrants, the situation of human rights defenders, and the important question of support to the Libyan authorities going forward. May I start with accountability? As you know well, the question of ending impunity, addressing violations, giving hope to victims, deterrence to offenders is critical for the future of the country. It is why the High Commissioner deeply regrets that despite the many calls made by UN bodies, including the Human Rights Council itself, the many calls on Libyan authorities to increase efforts to hold all those responsible for crimes accountable, violations of international humanitarian and human rights law continue to be committed with almost utter impunity. Today, as many have acknowledged, there is still no mechanism at national level to ensure accountability, protection of civilians, or the right to remedy for victims consistent with international standards. The consequence is that victims and perpetrators alike feel there is absolutely no consequence for human rights violations and abuses, a situation that only feeds regression, repetition, and further impost of great cruelty to the people of Libya, as we believe is evidenced by serious crimes committed since resurgence of hostilities. It's why we strongly support establishment of an investigative mechanism into those serious and grave violations, committed by all parties, be they state or non-state actors, and we would strongly urge the Security Council and the international community to take all necessary measures to reinforce the capacity of UNSMIL and the International Criminal Court and the human rights component of UNSMIL in order that accountability not be put beyond our reach. But most importantly, support is needed to increase the capacity of Libya's regular courts and its justice infrastructure in order that it may deal in a timely manner, impartially and authoritatively with crimes in line with international standards. Many interventions focused understandably on the situation of migrants in Libya. The European Union, Croatia, Mali, Angola, Germany, Iraq on behalf of the Arab group all remarked upon the parlous circumstances of those detained as migrants in the country. And again we highlight and emphasise that the conditions in those centres have repeatedly been described by authorities beyond this place as inhumane. In our own report of last year, which we entitled appropriately Desperate and Dangerous, we gave great detail on the nature of those circumstances under which migrants are detained in the country. We described horrific human rights violations suffered by many at the hands also of smugglers and traffickers. And we emphasised the consequences for women and girls in that context. It is why we have highlighted our grave concerns that while we appreciate the Interior Ministry's announcement of closure of the 3 detention centres, our grave concern is that that decision is yet to be implemented. I must further reiterate that there is no credible basis on which to consider Libya a safe port for return. And we encourage the European Union to cease all support to and cooperation with the Libyan Coast Guard in their role of intercepting migrants and refugee vessels and in their efforts to return those intercepted to Libya. We continue to urge states to actively support search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean and to adopt a human rights-based mechanism for the timely and safe disembarkation of all migrants who are rescued at sea. We call on the government of Libya to take all necessary measures to swiftly transform the conditions in detention centres and to close migrant detention centres as well as fully engage with UN agencies to establish in their place safe and open shelters for all migrants who otherwise are at risk of detention. And we urge Member States to do all that you can to identify and prosecute those responsible for these heinous crimes, other violations and abuses against migrants, asylum seekers and refugees in Libya. The distinguished representative of Ireland further inquired as to what the international community might do with regards to migrants in areas not under government control. And as, of course, we've described in detail on this occasion and at other times, while the conditions for migrants and refugees in Libya were dire prior to the escalation of hostilities, the conflict has only worsened that situation. Refugees and migrants are now at added risk in conflict areas, being exposed to crossfire, being actively targeted or forcibly recruited, indeed, into those armed groups. This is why we would urge states to put pressure on all parties to the conflict to close detention centres where migrants continue to be held, to ensure that UN agencies have access to those places, put an end to the suffering of migrants in all parts of the territory, which also depends upon re-establishment of search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean and adoption of a human rights-based mechanism for timely and safe disembarkation. Turning to the situation of human rights defenders, as emphasised by the distinguished representatives of Belgium, the United Kingdom and our esteemed colleagues from UN Women, we very much share the concerns expressed about the situation of human rights defenders which is occurring, a situation that is unacceptable and takes place in the face of a long-standing pattern, particularly of armed groups targeting human rights defenders, media professionals and others who stand up for human rights. The UN's mission is working on a daily basis to provide direct support to victims of such attacks, including to journalists, and we do so by intervening with the government and other counterparts on individual cases. We support the victims, providing referral services, helping them to document their cases, and indeed organising and supporting workshops with civil society to strengthen solidarity with human rights defenders. However, many human rights defenders and journalists have already fled the country, have already been arrested, abducted, even killed, while others have been forced to curtail their activism or simply gone into hiding, and yet still some brave individuals at grave risk to their lives continue to speak out. In areas under control of the government, journalists, however, have also faced increased restrictions on their work, including encountering difficulties when seeking to obtain accreditation, authorisation to cover events, and indeed the authorities have taken measures to curtail the operations of independent non-governmental organisations. We therefore urge the government to suppress those measures and, to the contrary, to support new legislation to provide NGOs with the framework they need to undertake their activities independently, impartially, constructively and with confidence. Which turns me now to the question as posed by such as the distinguished representative of Germany, the distinguished representative of Australia and our esteemed colleagues from RADO. How can we best support the government? The Arab group, Angola, Burkina Faso also emphasised how important that support is at this time. At the bare minimum, and this must be done, we are monitoring the human rights violations, the costs to the people of Libya, documenting those matters and ensuring that the world is not turning blind eye to them. We are cooperating with the UN panel of experts. We cooperate with the International Criminal Court. And as the SRSG noted in his last Council briefing, the enormity of that task should not be underestimated. And it has been further constrained by the security situation, by limited access and insufficient resources. And again, we urge the international community and the Security Council to take all necessary measures to strengthen the availability of technical cooperation and support to the government and for the mission to fulfil its mandate in proportion with the need for it to do just that. On the question of how to build circumstances conducive to ceasefire and to reconciliation, again we echo the Special Representative of the Secretary-General's advice to the UN Security Council that violations of the arms embargo, which have become both routine and often blatant by both of the main parties to the conflict, must be denounced. It's important that the international community sends strong message on the need to respect the arms embargo, to commit to non-interference in the affairs of the country, and to address the main causes of the conflict as described and analysed by Libyans themselves. This is extremely important if a political formula of credibility, trust and respect from the people of Libya is to be enacted. And we call on Member States to provide full support to the plan proposed by the Special Representative of the UN's Secretary-General in Libya. And we thank this Council for its continued attention to these matters of grave concern and to the human rights of the people of Libya. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.